March 19th, 1964 was a cold and dark day here in Elmyra. It was the day 12-year-old Mary Teresa Simpson was found dead here on Combs Hill Road. Now, 61 years later, her case is finally closing.
This is a historic day for the Elmyra Police Department. Justice after almost 62 years.
February 10th, 2026. A police chief walks to a podium in Elmyra, New York. The room is packed. Cameras, reporters, officials. And in the back of that room, a woman in her 70s sits quietly with her hands folded in her lap. She has been waiting for this moment for 61 years. Chief Kristen Thorne leans into the microphone. This is a historic day for the Elmyra Police Department. The woman in the back of the room closes her eyes. 61 years. That is how long it took to get to this room, to this podium, to this moment. And everything that led here started on a Sunday evening in March of 1964, when a 12-year-old girl walked out of her mother's apartment and never came home. Her name was Mary Teresa Simpson. And this is what happened to her. Hi viewers, here is a quick question before we go further into this story. Did you grow up in a small town where everyone knew everyone? Drop a yes or no in the comments right now. Mary Teresa was 12 years old in the spring of 1964. She was the youngest of 4 children born to Ellsworth and Rose Simpson, a couple who had separated the year before. The family had been living in Hammondsport, a small town south of the Finger Lakes, but 2 weeks before her death, Mary Teresa and her father had moved back to Elmyra. 2 weeks. That was all the time she had in that city before the city swallowed her whole. Elmyra sat along the Chemung River in upstate New York. A working city. A quiet city. Around 40,000 people living in wood-frame houses that spread out from the downtown core into neighborhoods of tree-lined streets and small front yards. The kind of place where families knew their neighbors. Where kids walked to school alone.
Right now, I do feel very happy that it finally got solved after almost 62 years. It's going to take me a little while for it to sink in. And I thank everybody for all their help, how they did it. You know, I'm just happy.
If he were alive today, we would prosecute the case because, indeed, there is no statute of limitations on murder.
Where a 12-year-old girl walking a few blocks at dusk on a Sunday evening was not something anyone would think twice about. That Sunday was March 15th, 1964. Mary Teresa had spent the afternoon with her mother. The visit was unannounced. Rose had not been expecting her, but she was happy to see her. The two of them had been apart for nearly a year. The separation between her parents had split the household, and Mary Teresa had been living with her father while her mother stayed in Elmyra. 2 weeks back in the city, and already she was finding her way back to the people she had missed. They spent the afternoon together. Just a mother and her youngest daughter catching up. Talking. Being in the same room again. Around 6:30 that evening, Mary Teresa got up to leave. She was heading back to her father's apartment on foot. The route was short. A few blocks through the residential east side of the city. Streets she had known her whole life before the move. Streets lined with houses, front porches, familiar corners. March in upstate New York means the light dies early. By 6:30, the sky was already fading. The sidewalks were mostly empty. Families were inside for the evening. Dinner tables, warm kitchens, the sound of the television through front windows. Mary Teresa walked out into that quiet and disappeared. Ellsworth waited that evening for the sound of the door. It never came. He waited through dinner. Through the early hours of the evening. He told himself she had probably stopped somewhere. Maybe she had gone back to see a friend. Maybe she had lost track of time. But the hours kept passing. He started making calls. He called Rose. He called relatives. He called everyone he could think of who might know where she was or who might have seen her. Nobody had. Nobody remembered seeing Mary Teresa walking on those streets that evening. Not a single person. He contacted the Elmyra police that night. She was officially listed as missing.
Later that month, we were informed that the sperm located on the underwear and skirt, item 7A, worn by Mary Teresa Simpson, matched Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. Statistically, the probability of selecting an unrelated individual that matches this evidence was less than 1 in 320 billion. This DNA evidence establishes that the identified individual was directly involved with Mary Teresa Simpson at or near the time of her death. Alfred Murray, Jr. was born in Elmyra, New York in 1931. He lived and worked in this community, raised a family here, and remained in Elmyra for the entirety of his life.
And somewhere between her mother's door and her father's apartment, on a quiet Sunday evening in a city of 40,000 people, a 12-year-old girl had simply ceased to exist. Nobody saw what happened. Nobody heard anything. Nobody came forward with a name. The streets were empty. And whoever had been on those streets with her was already gone. For days. That is how long Mary Teresa Simpson was missing before anyone found her. For days of searching. For days of knocking on doors and walking riverbanks and pushing through frozen brush on wooded hillsides. For days of Ellsworth sitting by the phone. For days of Rose trying to hold herself together. For days of Linda, 16 years old, watching the adults around her slowly lose hope while pretending they hadn't. The search began the morning after she was reported missing. Elmyra police spread out across the east side of the city first. Officers walked every block between Rose's apartment and Ellsworth's. They knocked on every door. They stopped anyone who had been outside that Sunday evening and asked what they had seen. They checked basements, garages, empty lots, every space a 12-year-old girl might have wandered into or been pulled into. Nothing. Volunteers joined the effort. They spread out along both banks of the Chemung River, moving through the parks and open stretches on the outskirts of the city. Search parties pushed into the wooded areas and logging roads that surrounded Elmyra on its southern and western edges. The terrain was rough, hilly and heavily forested, with patches of snow and ice still sitting on the ground from the winter that had not quite finished. The search parties moved slowly, carefully, calling her name into the trees. The city held its breath. Then came the fourth day. March 19, 1964. A man was hiking through the woods off Combs Hill Road with his 2 young sons when they came upon something that stopped him cold. On a wooded hillside roughly 5 miles southwest of downtown Elmyra, partially hidden beneath heavy stones, tree branches, layers of leaves, and packed earth, was the body of a 12-year-old girl. It was Mary Teresa Simpson. She had been there since shortly after she disappeared. The county medical examiner's autopsy confirmed that she had been assaulted and that the cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation. Soil and twigs had been stuffed into her mouth. And the manner in which her body had been concealed told investigators something important about the person who had done this. The weight of the stones alone. The layers of material piled carefully on top of her. This had not been rushed. Whoever left her there had taken time. Had worked deliberately. Had made sure she would not be found easily. That detail would stay with investigators for decades. The Elmyra Police Department shifted immediately from a missing person search to a full homicide investigation. Detectives fanned out across the city. They interviewed anyone who had been in the area on the evening of March 15, men who lived along the roads leading toward Combs Hill Road. Men who had been seen driving in that area that Sunday. Men with prior records involving children.
They left no rock left unturned. When you look at this, we're talking about 6,000 pages of investigation. So it's amazing that they missed this individual when they were investigating. Shows how sophisticated he may have been.
But advances in genetic genealogy proved to be much more sophisticated.
Police were very thorough with the investigation. It's always amazing when it's a stranger that only forensic genetic genealogy can solve it.
Detectives pulled criminal files at the local level, the state level, the federal level. They cross-referenced every name in the growing case file against the known facts. Against the timeline. Against the geography of the crime. Tips flooded in from across Chemung County and the surrounding region. Every single one was followed up. 300 people were interviewed in the 7 months that followed. 300. In a city of 40,000. That number represented an enormous, exhausting, citywide effort to find the person responsible for what had happened to a 12-year-old girl on a Sunday evening in March. And after all of it, there was nothing. No viable suspect. No meaningful lead. No name that held up under scrutiny. The local radio station WELM and the Star-Gazette newspaper raised a $1,000 reward for information leading to the killer's identification. The community responded. Residents who had never met Mary Teresa, who had never spoken to the Simpson family, donated what they could. The murder had shaken Elmyra in a way that nothing else had in recent memory. A child taken off a residential street in broad enough daylight that someone should have seen something. Nobody had. By 1972, the reward had grown to $5,000. It was never collected. The case file grew thick. Interviews, tip sheets, follow-up reports, cross-reference logs. The paperwork filled entire filing cabinets in the department's records room. Years passed. Detectives who had worked the case retired or transferred. New officers inherited the file, sat down with the stacks of paper, read through everything, and searched for anything that had been missed. They always reached the same conclusion.
Mary was laid to rest here at St. Peter and Paul's Cemetery in the south side of the city. But the mystery would remain unsolved as Mary's glasses, clothing, and other personal items sat in a vault frozen in time as evidence.
It had dried up long ago. The file stayed open. But the trail was cold. And the man who had taken Mary Teresa Simpson off that street was somewhere in Elmyra, living his life, and his name did not appear anywhere in those filing cabinets. Not once. In 300 interviews and thousands of pages of documentation, nobody had ever come close to him. He had simply never come up. And that is what made it so haunting. He was not hiding. He was not gone. He was right there. In the same city. On the same streets. And for 61 years, nobody knew. Linda Simpson was 16 years old when her sister was taken. She had been separated from Mary Teresa for nearly a year before their father moved the family back to Elmyra. 2 weeks of being in the same city again. 2 weeks of the possibility of getting close again. And then Mary Teresa was gone, and Linda was left standing in the middle of a grief that never fully lifted, not in the months that followed, not in the years, not in the decades. She watched the investigation unfold and then stall. She watched the detectives work the case and come up empty. She watched the newspapers cover it and then move on. She watched the reward money sit uncollected year after year. She watched her parents age under the weight of not knowing. Ellsworth grew old carrying it. Rose grew old carrying it. Neither of them lived long enough to hear the name of the man who took their youngest daughter off the street that evening. Linda kept calling the Elmyra Police Department anyway. Once a year. Sometimes more. She would pick up the phone and ask if there was anything new. The answer was always the same. There was nothing new. The file was still open. They had not forgotten. But there was nothing new. She called anyway. Because someone had to. Think about that for a moment. 60 years of phone calls. 60 years of the same answer. And she kept calling. Not because she expected a breakthrough. But because she refused to let the silence become permanent. Because her mother deserved to know. Because Mary Teresa deserved more than a cold file in a records room. I did this for my mom. That is what Linda said later. For words that carried 60 years inside them. In the year 2000, 36 years after the murder, Mary Teresa's clothing was submitted to the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center for analysis. The items had been collected at the time of the autopsy in 1964 and had been stored in evidence ever since. 36 years in storage. The technology to examine biological material at the level now available had not existed when the crime was committed. It had taken 3.5 decades for science to catch up to this case.
And then started digging through the Star-Gazette newspaper back in 1964, and voila, there she is.
It was an amazing book. She filled me in on everything while she was writing it. I agreed to it, and I was so glad that I could help her out. And I haven't got a chance to read the book myself because I'm afraid of breaking down. So,
But one day.
Analysts examined the blouse first. They found biological material. And from that material, they were able to develop a male DNA profile. A clear, usable, comparable genetic profile of the unknown person who had been with Mary Teresa Simpson on the night she was killed. The profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national database, a system that stores genetic profiles from convicted offenders across the country and automatically compares them against evidence from unsolved cases. If the man who killed Mary Teresa had ever been convicted of a qualifying offense anywhere in the United States and had his DNA collected, the system would have found him. It came back empty. He was not in the system. 3 years later, in 2003, additional clothing was submitted to the lab. Analysts examined her skirt and underwear and recovered more biological material. The additional samples confirmed the original profile from the blouse and made it stronger. The profile was solid, clear, ready for comparison the moment a suspect could be identified. But there was no suspect. And here is the detail that will stay with you. The man whose DNA was on that clothing was still alive in 2003. He was living in Elmyra. He was in his early 70s, going about his life in the same city where he had committed this crime nearly 40 years earlier. The database had no record of him. He had never been collected. He had never been a suspect. And while forensic scientists in a laboratory were confirming his genetic profile from evidence that had waited decades to be examined, he was still there. 1 year later, in March of 2004, he died. He was buried in an Elmyra cemetery less than 5 miles from the wooded hillside off Combs Hill Road where he had left Mary Teresa's body 40 years before. His DNA was never collected during his lifetime. His name had never appeared in the case file. And with his death, it seemed like the last possible door had closed. But it hadn't. In 2022, the Elmyra Police Department applied for and received a grant through Season of Justice, a non-profit organization that provides funding to law enforcement agencies for advanced forensic testing in cold cases. The grant covered the full cost of submitting the DNA evidence to a private laboratory equipped to work with samples that were nearly 60 years old. The DNA was sent to Othram, a private forensic genetics laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram specializes in building usable genetic profiles from degraded biological material. The samples from the Simpson case were among the oldest the lab had ever worked with. Decades of storage under varying conditions had taken a toll on the biological material. What remained was fragmented, degraded, a faint genetic signal buried under 60 years of time. Othram scientists applied a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing. They pulled every strand of usable information from that degraded material. And from samples collected on a wooded hillside in upstate New York in 1964, they built a full and workable genetic profile of the unknown male. That profile was then uploaded to public genealogy databases, platforms where millions of Americans have voluntarily submitted their own genetic information to trace their ancestry and find long-lost relatives. The FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team took the profile and began searching for relatives of the unknown person through those databases. Not looking for the man himself. Looking for his family. His cousins. His distant relatives. Anyone who shared enough genetic material to point toward a family line. In 2023, investigators partnered with the Criminal Investigation Resource Center at Russell Sage College in upstate New York. Dr. Christina Lane, a criminologist and associate professor, brought her students into the research effort. The students handled the records-level work. Birth certificates. Marriage records. Census data. Death records. The FBI team managed the genetic comparisons. Together they built outward from the DNA matches, branch by branch, generation by generation. The work was slow. The family tree reached back into the early 20th century. Many of the relatives in the tree had been born before reliable record-keeping existed. Marriage records had gaps. Some individuals had moved out of the region, changed their names, or simply left no trace in any public record. Branches of the tree went cold and had to be reapproached from a different angle. But the team kept narrowing. By 2025, after more than 2 years of methodical genealogical work, every branch of that tree had been examined and eliminated except one. One branch remained. And at the end of that branch was a man who had lived in Elmyra, New York, in 1964. A man who had been 32 years old at the time of the murder. A man who had spent his entire life in the same city where the crime took place. A man who had been dead for over 20 years. They had a name. But a name was not enough. They needed the science to confirm it. They needed certainty. The kind of certainty that leaves no room for doubt, no space for a defense, no possibility of error. Because this was not just a cold case. This was Mary Teresa Simpson. And she deserved more than a probable answer. Investigators contacted the man's surviving son. They explained the investigation. They explained what the genealogical research had found. And the son agreed to provide a voluntary DNA sample. The results came back. The genetic comparison confirmed a parent-child relationship between the son and the unknown male whose DNA had been recovered from Mary Teresa's clothing. Half of a child's genetic material comes from each parent. The match was clear and consistent. The family line had been confirmed. But investigators took one final step. They obtained legal authorization to exhume the suspect's remains from the cemetery where he had been buried for more than 20 years. The remains were carefully recovered, documented, and transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for analysis. DNA extracted directly from those exhumed remains was compared against the male profile that had been developed from Mary Teresa's clothing in 2000 and confirmed in 2003. The match was definitive. The odds of selecting an unrelated individual who would produce the same genetic profile were less than 1 in 320 billion. 1 in 320 billion. His name was Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. Born in 1931. Raised in Elmyra. He served in the United States Army during the Korean War and came home to the same city he had always known. He married a woman named Rosemary. Together they had 4 children. A daughter named Charlotte. A son named Louis. A daughter named Becky. And a son named Alfred III, who died in 1979. Murray worked for much of his adult life as a truck driver. He knew the roads around Elmyra the way most people know the layout of their own home. The back roads. The logging trails. The wooded stretches on the southern edge of the city. The hillsides above town. He was known to local police for past behavior involving children. The department had records on him going back years before the murder. And yet in 7 months of exhaustive investigation, in over 300 interviews, in thousands of pages of documentation, his name never came up. Not once. No witness connected him to Mary Teresa. No tip pointed toward him. No record placed him anywhere near her on the evening of March 15, 1964. He was never interviewed. He was never asked a single question. He went home that night and kept going. He kept driving his routes. Kept showing up at family gatherings. Kept living in Elmyra for more decades as if nothing had happened. Because as far as anyone around him knew, nothing had. Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. Died on March 16, 2004. He was 73 years old. His obituary was published in the Star Gazette on March 19, 2004. March 19. The same date that Mary Teresa's body had been found on Combs Hill Road. Exactly 40 years later, to the day. The obituary listed his wife Rosemary, his surviving children, his grandchildren, his military service. It described a man who had spent his whole life in one city, served his country, and raised a family. It did not mention Mary Teresa Simpson. At the time of his death, those two names had never been spoken in the same sentence. They had never been connected by any investigation, any record, any witness. He had lived his entire life in the same city as the family of the girl he had taken, and not one person had ever drawn a line between them. February 10, 2026. Elmyra Police Chief Kristen Thorne stood at the podium and looked out at the room. Beside her were representatives from the FBI and the Chemung County District Attorney's Office. Behind her, the weight of 61 years. In front of her, cameras, reporters, and a woman in her 70s sitting quietly in the back of the room. Linda Simpson had spent 6 decades making phone calls that went nowhere. She had watched her parents die without answers. She had carried her sister's name through every year that passed, through every disappointment, through every holiday and anniversary and ordinary Tuesday where the absence of Mary Teresa made itself felt all over again. She was in that room now. Chief Thorne addressed the assembled media. This is a historic day for the Elmyra Police Department. If Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. were still alive, the district attorney's office would seek criminal charges against him for murder. The evidence was clear. The identification was confirmed. The case that had outlasted every detective who ever touched it, that had sat in a records room for 6 decades, that had been the defining unsolved crime in the history of this department, was closed. Linda sat in the back of that room and heard it. "I am very happy it is finally ended," she said afterward. "I just wish my mom was here." 6 words. A lifetime inside them. Mary Teresa Simpson was 12 years old. She had been back in Elmyra for 2 weeks. She had spent a Sunday afternoon with her mother, catching up after months apart, and she had walked out into the early evening to go home. She never made it. The man who stopped her on that walk lived in the same city for 40 more years. He drove the same roads. He was buried less than 5 miles from the hillside where he left her. And it took a laboratory in Texas, a college classroom in upstate New York, a genealogy database, an exhumation, and 61 years of a sister refusing to stop calling before anyone ever said his name out loud in connection with hers. That is the truth of this case. Not just what was done, but how long it was allowed to remain unanswered. And what it finally took to answer it. Linda walked out of that press conference on February 10, 2026, carrying something she had not carried in 6 decades. A name. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. And if you want to know about the cold case where an entire family vanished without a trace, only for investigators to uncover a secret that had been buried for over 30 years, that story is coming next. You will not want to miss it.